Just an impromptu video today. I wasn't planning on recording a video this week, but yesterday I watched the Joe Rogan episode with Graham Hancock and Flint Dibble, and I have some thoughts about it. I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm not going to talk about the archaeology itself that was discussed, but I was thinking about, and this reminds me of other situations that I've been in where I've had conversations with people who had historical or pseudo-archaeological ideas. And so I just have some advice for anyone who's in my position, somebody who might be an academic or someone who's academically minded and who gets into a conversation with someone who has alternative ideas coming from the alternative space, the alternative world, to like how to approach that kind of conversation. And I just want to clarify that I'm not criticizing Flint Dibble. I think he did a fine job. This is for people in general, like just anyone out there. These are just some thoughts that came into my head as I was watching that episode, and I might reference a couple of things in there for examples. First of all, I want to clarify why I use the term pseudoarchaeology, and I'll also be using the term pseudohistory, and I mean it in a similar way, but I know that Graham Hancock takes exception to the term pseudoarchaeology. So let me explain why I use the term. The way Graham Hancock frames the debate, like the overall, like the big debate between him and like archaeological consensus or traditional archaeology, the way he frames it is a clash of worldviews or a clash of dogmas. That he has one point of view, and then the archaeologists have another dogmatic point of view, and they disagree with each other. And the archaeologists are objecting to Graham Hancock's ideas because they disagree with the dogma. And I think that's the wrong way to understand it. And this gets to the point of what is the difference between what archaeology is and what Graham Hancock is doing. And Graham Hancock does not claim to be an archaeologist, I know, but his ideas are not... the difference between his ideas and what archaeologists are saying is the difference in methodology. The important thing when you're doing archaeology or when you're doing history or science or any of those things is you start with evidence. You base starting with in the sense of your foundation is in the evidence. In history, your foundation is in the primary sources. That's where everything has to go back to. And then you build from there. Here's what the primary sources say. And then here's what we can extrapolate based on that. Or in the case of archaeology is here's what the physical artifacts are. Here's the actual physical evidence. And then here's what we can extrapolate from that. And that's not Graham Hancock's approach. Graham Hancock, as far as I can tell, starts with a conclusion. He's decided that there was a civilization 12,000 years ago. And he's going to find whatever evidence supports that. And any evidence that doesn't support that, he's just going to ignore. So that methodologically, that's fundamentally not what archaeologists do, or at least that's not what archaeologists are supposed to do. And so that's the difference. And so that's why I call it pseudo-archaeology, because he's not using archaeological methods, but he's arriving at conclusions, or at least he's starting with conclusions, whichever way you want to look at it, that look archaeological. He's making claims about 12,000 years ago. So that would be, on the surface, that would seem to be an archaeological claim, but he didn't get there through archaeological means. That's why I call it pseudo-archaeology. And there's a similar thing in history where there are a lot of historical narratives out floating around in the public that are not based on real evidence. They're not based on the sources. They're based on ideology or politics or culture, or some other thing, where they've done essentially the same thing, where they've started with a conclusion, they have this narrative in mind, and then they cherry pick whatever evidence supports that, and they ignore whatever evidence doesn't support it. So that's why I use that term. I'm not trying to use it disparagingly. I'm simply saying that if you were to arrive at the conclusion that there was Atlantis, and you used the methods of archaeology, and you took into account all of the evidence that archaeologists have found, then I would call that an archaeological position, not a pseudo-archaeological position. So it's not it's not Atlantis itself that's the problem. It's not Atlantis itself that's pseudo-archaeological. It's the way you get there that's pseudo-archaeological. And if you get there, taking into account all the evidence that's out there, then I won't call it pseudo-archaeological anymore. So here's the advice I have for academics, particularly historians, I guess. First of all, don't ever assume bad faith. Don't ever assume that they're deliberately distorting evidence on purpose. That's redundant, in order to fool people or in order to grift people, extract money from people. I don't think Graham Hancock is a grifter. I don't think he's deliberately lying on purpose. Why did I do that again? I don't think he's doing it on purpose. And I don't think the people who subscribe to his ideas, some of them might be lying. I don't know. I don't know them. But I think many of them earnestly, sincerely desire the truth. And they think this is where the truth is. And they're being honest about it and sincere about it. So don't ever assume bad faith. And let me give you an example from a different realm to kind of illustrate what I mean. Carl Sagan, in the first episode of Cosmos back in 1980, presented a picture of the history of science. He talked about science in ancient Greece, Eratosthenes calculating the circumference of the Earth. He talked about, and then he talked about the Library of Alexandria and how it contained all this knowledge of the world. Then he talked about how it was destroyed in Hypatia and the death of Hypatia. And then he talked about there was this 1,000 years of dark ages where there was no science, no advancement going on. And then in the Renaissance, they picked up where they had left off. Every bit of that narrative that he presents is wrong. It's incorrect. It is pseudo-history. It's not based on the sources. The sources say something very different. If you ask people who are in the field, they will tell you, nope, no, that's right. It's untrue. It is pseudo-history. And this is coming from Carl Sagan, who famously, he's a science communicator, famously warrior against pseudoscience. How is he peddling pseudo-history? How is that possible? It's because anyone is capable of doing it. Anyone could fall into that. Don't think of don't think in a binary term of the good guys versus the bad guys, the camp that believes in truth versus the camp that believes in lies, that promotes lies. Don't frame it in that way. Everyone is capable of believing in a false narrative because it's impossible. Oftentimes it's impossible to know whether the stuff that you've been taught is true or not. You just, I think what happened with Carl Sagan is that was the narrative he had been taught. That's the narrative he had picked up over the years, and he never questioned it. It never occurred to him to question it. He probably was never presented with contrary evidence. If he did, he may have used some logical fallacy to dismiss that evidence. Maybe he didn't believe that it was coming from a reputable source or whatever. I don't know. I don't know about that. I just know that Carl Sagan, a very smart man, a man who believed in truth and wanted to promote truth, did a lot of damage, honestly, to the public understanding of the history of science with that episode. The same kind of damage that is done by pseudo-archaeologists. And he wasn't a grifter. He wasn't doing it to fool people. He wasn't trying to lie. He just fell into that. And, the only way, and it really, all that comes down to is you hear a thing and it doesn't occur to you to question it. And then maybe you repeat it to other people and you don't fact check it and it ends up being wrong. I mean, that can happen to anybody. And that's, I think, what happens to a lot of people who consume pseudo-archaeology. That's the only exposure they have to archaeological information. So it doesn't occur to them to question it. No one, absolutely no one fact checks every little bit of information that they think about the world, every little corner of their worldview. They don't. Nobody does that. It would be exhausting. You'd be on Snopes all day long. You'd never get anything done. Like, at some point, you just have to accept the narrative that you've been taught and go on with your day, And I think that's what's going on with people who believe in pseudo-archaeological stuff or pseudo-historical stuff. They're not trying to believe in falsehood. And so don't treat them like they are. treat them like they earnestly want the truth, because I think most of them do. And then related to that is, if you hear someone in a conversation, and this is something I always have to like check myself on and make sure that I'm doing this. If you hear someone repeat some pseudo-historical claim or a pseudo-archaeological claim, to you, that might be the 100th time you've heard it. And you roll your eyes, and you're like, oh, this BS again. But to that person that you're talking to, they haven't heard it 100 times from 100 different people. And maybe and maybe those 100 times you heard it from some of those guys were, obviously tendentious. They obviously had some axe to grind. They had some political axe to grind or whatever. And that's why they were repeating that. But the particular person you're talking to doesn't necessarily have that axe to grind. They just heard that. That's the only thing they've heard. They haven't heard anything that contradicts it. And so if we react with, oh, this again, it reinforces that image that people have about academics, that they are dismissive and arrogant and also dogmatic. All that stuff that Graham Hancock claims about academics, which actually some academics are those things, to be honest. Actually, I think this is something I'm going to be coming back to a little bit later, but I'm reminded of the presidential candidate debates in 1988 between George Bush and Michael Dukakis, when the moderator at one of the debates asked Michael Dukakis, because Dukakis had a position of the death penalty is never okay. You should never have the death penalty. And the moderator of the debate asked him, well, what if your wife, Kitty Dukakis, were attacked and killed? Would you still be opposed to the death penalty then? Now, Michael Dukakis had heard that question 100 times from different reporters and different people. He heard it over and over and over again. And he was kind of tired of hearing it. And so he was like, he seemed a little bit exasperated when he was giving the answer. And then he gave this kind of rote, kind of unemotional response of like, explaining his position. He had heard that question 100 times, but the general public, 99% of the people watching, had not heard him hear that question 100 times. They were hearing that question for the first time. And so, and he talked about this after the election, how he should have recognized that fact and treated it as if it were the first time he was hearing that question, because it sounded like, because of the way he answered it, it sounded like he was unemotional about the idea of his wife being attacked and killed. But it was simply the fact that he had just heard that question so many times, that he was kind of numb to the question at that point. But that's something we also have to keep in mind, when we're encountering these ideas. The individual person who's asking you about this hasn't asked you 100 times. You might have heard it 100 times, but that person only heard it once, and now he's talking to you about it. The third piece of advice is that we should recognize that usually what makes people excited about a pseudo-archaeological or pseudo-historical idea is the same thing that makes us excited about archaeology and history. It's the wonder. It's the, like getting to know about the lives of people who lived long ago, getting a sense of the vastness of the human past and how vast and complex it is. It's kind of mind-blowing. And then seeing examples of how clever people were in the past, all that's really exciting. Those are the kinds of things that make us excited about history and archaeology. And the thing is, a lot of people, they discover these ideas for the first time through the medium of pseudo-archaeology or pseudo-history. It's like the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is not a serious history book, and no historian who works in world history takes it seriously. Some people have accused me of parroting it in one of my videos, and I wasn't. But the reason they were accusing me of that is because it was in a video where I was dealing with macro issues in global history. And for a lot of people, their only exposure to global history is Guns, Germs, and Steel. So they hear somebody talking about global history, and I think they automatically go back to that book. That was the only exposure they had. And a lot of people are really excited when they read a book like that, because I think a lot of times it's the first time they've ever been exposed to the perspective of looking at history globally and looking at these vast timescales and this macro level, and just seeing it's just kind of like, whoa, it's just mind blowing. When you first encounter that. There are other historians who do that kind of thing much better, like William H. McNeill, or I don't know, off the top of my head, I can't think of their names, but Janet Abu-Lughod. There are people who are in the world history field that do much better work than Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's just so happens that Guns, Germs, and Steel was a bestseller, and so that's the one that people get exposed to. And I think that's true with ideas like Atlantis, or Graham Hancock's different ideas. It's the same thing. Like, people are kind of interested in ancient history. They're kind of interested in human archaeology, and and that's what they have available to them, and that's what they consume. And so they imbibe those ideas. So, and this is something Flint Dibble did really well in the episode with on Joe Rogan. He acknowledged that shared wonder, and he was like, yeah, Joe Rogan was like, wow, that's really cool. And then Flint would be like, yeah, that is really cool. Like that, and that's what we should always do. Like, people read that stuff or they watch that stuff on a show, and they're like, that's so cool. That's so cool. And they're not just, when they say it's so cool, they're not specifically necessarily reacting to the particular ideas that Graham Hancock is presenting, or Jared Diamond is, or whoever. It's just this general idea of, wow, this perspective I have, this perspective this thing is giving me that I had never gotten exposed to before. And then my fourth point is that we should be honest in recognizing and acknowledging that there are dogmatic academics. There are academics who refuse to consider other ideas, and who will shoot down ideas without entertaining them. There are subfields within history, and I assume also in archaeology, I don't know, but throughout academia, you'll have particular departments or particular little subfields where it is kind of hostile to new ideas. It doesn't mean that Graham Hancock's characterization of the entire field of archaeology is accurate, not at all. But if we pretend like that stuff doesn't happen, then when Graham Hancock brings up Clovis first, it makes it seem like we're being delusional or Pollyanna-ish about academia. And the fact is, if you've been in academia, you know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of really messed up, toxic people in academia. Let's just be honest. That's just a weird thing about academia. I guess that's probably human in general. Like, any field you go into, any profession you go into, any company you work for, there are going to be nasty, toxic people there. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I don't know anything about Clovis first. I don't do American archaeology. Obviously, it's way outside my field. But when I was in grad school, I did medieval Middle East. And I heard about this sort of thing happening in Ottoman studies. Now, I wasn't doing Ottoman studies, so this didn't affect me. In my own particular field, in my own particular, I had great professors in grad school. I had a good, I was lucky. But you can certainly encounter some of these things. And what I heard about when I was in grad school was the Ghazi thesis in Ottoman history. There was a guy named Paul Wittek, who is an Austrian Orientalist. An Orientalist is an old-fashioned term for somebody who studies the Middle East, basically studies Islamic history and stuff, or any ancient Near East or whatever. Orientalist was a kind of blanket term for that. And in the 1930s, he published stuff about the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire. And he presented something called the Ghazi, what we in retrospect call the Ghazi thesis, which was a certain a certain model, a certain perspective, interpretation of early Ottoman history. I don't need to go into it. Then 40 years later or so, Rudy Lindner came along and tried to publish something where he was revising that narrative and disagreed with the narrative. And he couldn't get published because Paul Vitek had such a predominance in the field. It was a very tiny field. And I think this is part of the issue. Like if you have a very tiny field with only a handful of people working in it, then you can get some of those toxic dynamics, I think, more readily than in a larger field. Ottoman studies was super tiny back then. And so, this Ghazi thesis had prevailed for decades. And when Rudy Lindner tried to publish something that went against it, he had a really hard time getting published. And as I recall, the way it was related to me, because I was told this by one of my professors in grad school, he almost wasn't able to stay in academia. Like it threatened his career. That's my understanding. I could be wrong. He could correct me maybe. I think he's still alive. But he did finally get it published, but he got it published in an obscure Hungarian studies series. Now that's changed since then. The Ghazi thesis has been discredited. Pretty much no one, as far as I know, no one in Ottoman history who does Ottoman history takes it seriously anymore. But you will still encounter it out in the wild, out in the public, because that's the nature of things. Like the public perception of a historical thing is often decades behind where the historians are. I'm sure it's the same thing with I know it's the same thing in archaeology because Graham Hancock on the podcast kept bringing up Clovis First, and he's like, Clovis First, you claim that back in the 90s it had been discredited. Well, here's this headline from 2008 about Clovis First. Is Clovis First going to be discredited? And here's this headline from 2016 or whatever. And of course, he was not distinguishing what archaeologists are doing and where they're publishing versus what the popular press is doing, which I find a really weird oversight. Like, shouldn't Graham Hancock be able to tell the difference between those two things? Like, how can you claim that the archaeological field is still sticking to Clovis First when your only pieces of evidence are headlines from popular press? It's so, I don't know, it's so weird. But anyway, but we have to be careful again not to present the image that we're pushing a narrative or we're pushing a worldview. We're pushing a method. We're saying it's about the evidence. And the fact is that eventually Lindner was vindicated. The Ottoman field moved on. And that's how it is in every academic field. The old toxic people die. New toxic people come along with different ideas. And then they publish different things and the fields change. No field stays the same. There is no academic dogma that stays the same over a period of decades. It's always changing. And that's something you should stress when talking to them, even when you have things like that come up. The point is, it always comes back to reinterpretation of evidence, reevaluation in the light of new evidence or new insights that people have come up with, and things are always changing. People in academia are not, as a whole, speaking generally, speaking collectively about people in academia, people in academia collectively are not committed to a certain ideology. They're committed to the idea of finding truth through evidence. And individuals within academia could lose sight of that and get convinced that their own theory or their own model is correct. But academia as a whole doesn't get stuck there. And my fifth piece of advice is that we always keep in mind that what we care about is the evidence. We start with the evidence. That's the basis of everything that we say. So don't fall into the trap of being like, well, we know that this is how the Stone Age happened. We might have a lot of evidence that leads us to certain conclusions that are pretty reliable, but don't frame it that way because the person you're talking to might not know all the information that you have. And if you say, well, we know the Stone Age was this, this, and this, it just plays into Graham Hancock's narrative that he has an idea of the past. The archaeologists have a different idea of the past, but it's a particular picture that they have. And they're clashing on the difference between these two pictures of the past. And that's not it. So bring it always back to the evidence. Say, they say, well, different civilizations were, Atlantis was going to different civilizations and founding different civilizations, whatever. Then say, oh, that's interesting. That'd be really cool, because honestly, it would be cool. So it's okay to acknowledge the fact that it would be cool if Atlantis had existed. I think we could all agree that would be that's the case. So just say, oh, that would be cool. But then what about this thing? So this idea that Atlantis was seafaring, and they were sailing the oceans and visiting different parts of the world. Oh, that's cool. That would be really cool if that were true. The only thing is, I don't get how there have been thousands of shipwrecks from the Stone Age, and they've always been like little boats that were made by hunter-gatherers. We've never found an ocean-going vessel of the kind that Atlantis would have been using. Why is that? I mean, and they're going to have a response. They'll just say, "Oh, the ocean floor, only 1% of the ocean floor, whatever." They'll have some way. They'll have some defense mechanism. Don't worry about that. You're planting the question in their mind. That's all you have to do. They're not going to acknowledge you because of human ego. They're never going to be like, "Oh my gosh, you're so right. I was wrong." Like, people don't do that in discussions. But you plant the idea in the person's head, and then they go off and they think about it. Or the thing about domestication, like this idea, the Atlanteans, their civilization collapsed and the people went to different parts of the world and they taught the hunter-gatherers how to farm. My response would be, that sounds really cool. That would be really awesome if that were true. I want to believe that, but I don't understand how to reconcile that with the fact that we know through, archaeological dating methods, we have these certain methods of dating archaeologically when domestication started in different parts of the world, and they started at different times. And sometimes in some parts of the world, it started thousands of years later than in another part. So I don't understand how it works. Did the Atlanteans go to the Near East and immediately start teaching them how to domesticate, but then they went to China and they waited 2,000 years and then started teaching people how to domesticate? Did they, how does that work? How does that physically work? Did the Atlantean refugees maintain a separate existence for those 2,000 years or whatever the number is? I don't know exactly what the delay was in China, but did they have maintained a separate existence and bred among themselves and passed on the knowledge of domestication to their children and told them, okay, 2,000 years from now, start teaching the local people? Just ask the question. Don't say, well, that's preposterous because. Just say, well, I don't get it. I want to believe that's true. I don't get it. How do you fit that with this evidence? Because if it's true, it's going to fit all the evidence, not just some of the evidence. That's the big issue that I have with Graham Hancock, is he seems to not care. If there's evidence that disagrees with him, he just ignores it. Come on, man. But on that point, I don't think he's deliberately lying. And I guess this gets back to what I was saying before, assume good faith. I think Graham Hancock, I think he sincerely believes what he's saying. I don't think he's deliberately misleading people. I don't consider him a grifter. I don't think that's an accurate representation of what he's doing. I just think that he doesn't think critically about his assumptions. And, many people, what's happening here is this Atlantis idea is part of his worldview. How many people can think critically about their own worldview? How many people can take their worldview and take it outside of their mind and look at it and look at the different angles? And this worldview is very interesting and it's not a part of who I am. Very few people can do that. It's really hard. It's not, I don't even know how you teach someone to do that. I don't know. But, if Graham Hancock's not able to do that, it just means he's normal, because that's how most people are, or at least a lot of people, that's how they are. And so, yeah. So anyway, just as an aside, don't jump to calling him a liar or calling him a grifter or whatever. I don't think it's not necessary. If he can't recognize the failings of his model, if he can't recognize the inconsistencies with what archaeologists are finding, That's just a blind spot on his part. Just like with Carl Sagan, like I don't think he was deliberately trying to mislead people about the history of science. I think there was a blind spot for him. That's all it was. I'm not going to call him a grifter. All right. My last point is, Atun Shea Films did a response video, and I want to echo something he said at the end of his video, which is that if you're an academic, make YouTube videos. Get yourself out there. I mean, okay, maybe it's not for everybody. I'm not saying you have to, but part of the issue with all of this pseudoarchaeology is it's just a lack of accurate, reliable, evidence-based information. It's just a lack of it. It's really hard to get good, sound information about the human past. It's really frustrating. When academics publish their research, they publish it using a lot of academic jargon, making a lot of assumptions about the field, because about what they're saying, because they're aiming it at other scholars, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that in particular. The intended audience is their peers in doing the same research or similar research. That's fine. But it does mean it's harder for the general public to delve into that and understand that stuff. But then there's another problem in academia that is not as innocent, and that is the fact that most academic research is behind a paywall. And so if you're not affiliated with an academic institution, you don't have access to it. That's a big problem. And so as a result, there are these vast gaps that the pseudo-archaeological and pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific communities can rush into and fill. There is a demand in the general public for reliable information. Most of the people out there want to know the truth. Some people want their egos stroked. Some people want their ideologies confirmed and their biases confirmed. A lot of people just want to know what happened. And, this oftentimes the pseudo-archaeological or pseudo-historical stuff is the only thing they have available. So the more people who have academic training or who have you don't even have to have formal academic training. If you've been researching, if you're doing the research, if you're, if you know how to do real research, and try to get it out there, try, through YouTube or whatever other means. I know YouTube's not for everybody. That's fine. But if you've been on the fence about it, if you're a grad student, for example, or if you're in academia in some regard and you've been thinking about doing it, go ahead and do it. I know there are a lot of factors that hinder academics from doing YouTube. And so, we've seen like a lack of academics, especially on the history side. It seems like there's more of that going on the science side where academics are involved, but, in terms of the field of history, there's a real lack of academics doing history videos. History might seem like this really vast niche in YouTube where tons of people are involved, but actually, I think there is still demand for people who have academic training if they can, communicate it. And so I would encourage you, if you've been thinking about, if you're in academia and you've been thinking about doing a YouTube channel, I would encourage you to do it. And it's a big learning curve, but just start small. You give a paper at a conference, just summarize the paper for the video. Don't give the paper again on the video. That won't work. I mean, I have a PhD, and I have trouble sometimes sitting through some of those papers at conferences. A lot of academics seem not to have real good presentation skills, to be honest, but don't just rehash your paper, but summarize your paper as if you were summarizing it for your friend who's not in your field. Or if you're in a seminar and you read a book and you think that book is really interesting, you think it has some really interesting ideas, just summarize the book. Do a 5-minute thing where you summarize the argument of the book. That's all you have to do to start out. We need a lot of academics on YouTube because it's easy to make pseudo content, pseudo historical content, or pseudo archaeological content. That's super easy because it's not based on a lot of rigorous research. It's a lot of vibe stuff, and vibes are easy. So it's easy to pump out that content. It's harder to produce content that is based on sound research. It takes a lot more work, a lot more effort. And so as a consequence, we need more creators on that side of things, putting out that content to counterbalance the amount of misleading content that's on YouTube or, in other venues online. So it's not like YouTube's going to fill up with academics and there won't be room for you anymore. Go ahead and jump in there, and try it out. And if it's not for you, don't do it. But if you've been thinking about it, if you've been on the fence about it, I would encourage you to do it. All right. Well, that's all I had to talk about. I'll get off my soapbox now. Have a good rest of your week.